12 years ago, the military's most legendary pilot vanished without a trace after uncovering a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Today, she would emerge from the shadows to prevent a coordinated attack on America's power grid that could plunge the entire Pacific Northwest into darkness and chaos. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Snake River Valley stretched endlessly beneath the crystal-clear Idaho sky, its rugged terrain carved by millennia of wind and water. Morning sunlight painted the distant peaks in shades of gold and amber, creating the kind of visibility that made veteran pilots feel alive. The air was still, perfect for flying, with barely a whisper of turbulence to disturb the serenity that blanketed the high desert landscape. A single Cirrus SR22 cut through this peaceful morning, its sleek, white fuselage gleaming against the backdrop of scattered clouds. The aircraft moved with unusual precision, following a flight path that seemed both deliberate and oddly familiar to anyone who might have been watching from the ground below. Inside the cockpit, Victoria Kane adjusted her heading with the fluid movements of someone who had spent more hours in the air than most people spend in their cars. At 42, she possessed the kind of calm confidence that only came from years of flying in situations where a single mistake meant death. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes simple jeans and a black leather jacket gave no hint of her extraordinary background. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced ease, checking altitude, airspeed, and navigation systems with the methodical precision of a professional. But there was something different about this flight, something in the set of her shoulders and the intensity of her focus that suggested this wasn't just another cross-country journey. Victoria glanced at her watch, then at the GPS display showing her position relative to a restricted airspace zone that lay directly ahead. Any reasonable pilot would have adjusted course by now, steering clear of the military-restricted area that protected one of America's most sensitive Air Force installations. But Victoria Kane had stopped being reasonable 12 years ago, when she discovered that the people she trusted most had been lying to her all along. 50 miles to the northeast, the morning calm at Mountain Home Air Force Base shattered as warning sirens began their urgent wail across the compound. In the base control tower, radar operators monitored their screens with growing concern as an unknown aircraft approached their restricted airspace. Unknown civilian aircraft bearing 090, altitude 8,000, speed 170 knots, announced Sergeant Tyler Webb, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the control room. No filed flight plan. Aircraft is not responding to radio contact. Major Benjamin Shaw strode across the control center, his jaw set with the kind of irritation that came from 15 years of dealing with civilian pilots who seemed incapable of reading sectional charts. At 38, Shaw had built his career on strict adherence to protocol and zero tolerance for unauthorized incursions into military airspace. How far into the restricted zone? Shaw demanded, leaning over Webb's shoulder to study the radar. Display, 6 miles and closing, sir. Maintaining steady course and altitude, no evasive maneuvers. Shaw's expression darkened. Mountain Home AFB was home to some of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, and unauthorized civilian aircraft represented both a security threat and a potential catastrophe if they collided with military traffic. Scramble interceptors. Immediately, Shaw ordered. I want that aircraft identified and escorted out of our airspace before it gets any closer to the flight line. The order rippled through the chain of command with military efficiency. Within minutes, 2 F-15EX Strike Eagles were rolling down the runway, their twin engines roaring as they accelerated into the clear morning sky. At the controls of the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Amanda Cross felt the familiar surge of acceleration press her back into her ejection seat as her fighter lifted off the tarmac. At 27, Amanda was one of the youngest pilots ever to qualify on the F-15EX, but her skills in the cockpit had earned her the respect of the entire squadron. She had joined the Air Force with dreams of following in the footsteps of the legendary pilots whose stories filled the classified corners of military aviation, pilots whose names were whispered in reverence, but whose achievements could never be publicly acknowledged. "Falcon Lead, this is Mountain Home Control," came Shaw's voice through her headset. "Intercept and identify civilian aircraft. Standard protocols. Use minimum force necessary to ensure compliance." "Copy that, Control," Amanda responded, adjusting her course toward the intercept point. "Falcon Flight, form up on me. Time to intercept, 3 minutes." Her wingman, Captain Jason Riley, acknowledged and moved into the textbook intercept formation they had practiced countless times. But as they climbed toward their target, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be different from the routine intercepts they usually handled. Back in the control center, Sergeant Webb continued tracking the civilian aircraft with growing puzzlement. "Sir, the aircraft is maintaining exact course and speed. No deviation at all, despite our repeated radio calls." Major Shaw frowned. Most civilian pilots who wandered into restricted airspace either panicked when contacted by military controllers or immediately changed course once they realized their mistake. This pilot's complete lack of response was unusual, almost as if they wanted to be intercepted. "Keep trying to raise them on all frequencies," Shaw ordered, "and get me a tail number identification as soon as possible." Webb's fingers flew across his keyboard as he ran the aircraft's transponder code through the national database. After a moment, his expression changed from routine concentration to confusion. "Sir, I'm getting some unusual readings from the transponder," Webb reported. "The signal pattern. It's not standard civilian equipment." Shaw moved closer to Webb's station, studying the complex waveforms displayed on the screen. "What do you mean, not standard?" "The frequency modulation is too sophisticated for normal civilian avionics. It's almost like..." Webb paused, running the signal through additional analysis programs. "Like military-grade encryption, sir. But that's impossible for a civilian aircraft." For the first time since the alert began, Major Shaw felt a chill of uncertainty. Civilian aircraft didn't carry military encryption equipment, and the pilot's complete lack of response to radio calls was becoming more ominous by the minute. In the Cirrus SR22, Victoria Kane monitored her instruments with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the flight. She could see the approaching F-15S on her radar display, right on schedule according to the timeline she had memorized years ago. Her expression never changed as she made a minor course correction, not to avoid the interceptors, but to ensure they would have a clear visual when they arrived. She had been planning this moment for 12 years, ever since the night she discovered that her own government had been lying to her about Operation Thunder Valley. Today, she would finally have the chance to finish what she had started all those years ago, before powerful people had forced her to disappear into the shadows. Amanda Cross spotted the Cirrus first, its white fuselage clearly visible against the high desert landscape below. "Visual contact established," she reported. Civilian aircraft at 2 o'clock, maintaining steady course and altitude. As she maneuvered her F-15 alongside the smaller aircraft, Amanda was surprised to see a woman at the controls. The pilot appeared completely calm, showing none of the panic or confusion that typically characterize civilian pilots who found themselves being intercepted by military fighters. "Civilian aircraft, this is United States Air Force Interceptor," Amanda broadcast on the emergency frequency. "You have entered restricted military airspace. Acknowledge immediately and follow my lead to approved airspace." Victoria Kane looked directly at the F-15 pilot and nodded once, clearly acknowledging the message. But instead of turning to follow the fighter's lead, she maintained her original heading. her hands steady on the controls as if she were simply flying to a weekend air show rather than defying direct orders from armed military aircraft. That something was happening in the skies above Idaho that went far beyond a simple airspace violation. And in her small civilian aircraft, Victoria Kane carried secrets that had been buried for 12 years, secrets that would soon change everything the military thought they knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of truth. Amanda Cross had intercepted dozens of civilian aircraft during her 3 years at Mountain Home, but she had never encountered a pilot like this one. The woman in the Cirrus SR22 flew with a precision that seemed almost supernatural, making minute adjustments to her course and altitude that maintained perfect formation, despite the vast difference in aircraft capabilities. Control: civilian pilot has acknowledged visual contact, but is not complying with directional instructions, Amanda reported, her professional tone masking growing concern. Repeat: aircraft is not following escort procedures. In the control tower, Major Shaw felt his patience evaporating. 20 minutes had passed since the civilian aircraft entered restricted airspace, and every minute of non-compliance represented a potential security breach that could have career-ending consequences. Lieutenant Cross, you are authorized to implement escalation protocols, Shaw commanded. Make it clear that compliance is not optional. Amanda maneuvered her F-15 into a more aggressive position, ensuring the civilian pilot could see the full capabilities of the intercepting aircraft. She repeated her warnings, adding emphasis about the consequences of continued non-compliance. The response was the same, a calm nod of acknowledgement, followed by steady maintenance of the original course. Control: civilian aircraft continues to ignore directional commands despite clear warnings, Amanda reported, bewilderment creeping into her voice. Pilot appears competent and aware, but is refusing to comply with any instructions. Meanwhile, Sergeant Tyler Webb continued analyzing the mysterious transponder signals emanating from the Cirrus. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Running the signal through increasingly sophisticated recognition software, he found patterns that shouldn't have existed on any civilian aircraft. Major Shaw, I need you to see this immediately, Webb called out, his voice tight with disbelief. Shaw approached Webb's station, irritation at the ongoing intercept situation warring with curiosity about his sergeant's obvious alarm. What is it, Webb? The transponder signal, sir. I've been running it through our historical database, and the system just found a match. Webb's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled up the results. It's showing a designation that was supposedly deactivated 12 years ago. Shaw stared at the screen, reading the identification that had appeared. The designation that displayed was one he had heard mentioned in classified briefings, but never seen in active operations. It was a calsign from the Black Operations files that most officers assumed was either classified fiction or a legend so deeply buried that it might as well have been myth. That's impossible, Shaw whispered. Run the analysis again. Webb's hands flew across his keyboard, double-checking every parameter and running the signal through multiple verification protocols. Each test returned the same result, each confirmation more disturbing than the last. System confirmed, sir. Designation: Storm Rider. Authentication protocols matching historical patterns from 12 years ago. The control room fell silent. Radar operators stopped their chatter. Communications personnel paused mid-sentence. Even the constant hum of electronic equipment seemed to quiet, as if the building itself had sensed that something extraordinary was happening. Storm Rider was more than just a calsign, it was a legend. Stories were told in hushed voices about a pilot whose skills transcended anything seen before or since. Someone who could fly aircraft beyond their design limitations and accomplish missions that defied both physics and common sense. But Storm Rider had vanished years ago, under circumstances that remained classified at the highest levels. Before Shaw could process the implications fully, The door to the control center burst open with unusual force. Colonel Frank Morrison entered with surprising speed for a man of 64. Though his decades of experience in special operations had kept him in remarkable physical condition despite his official retirement from active duty. "What did you just say?" Morrison demanded, his weathered face suddenly alert with an intensity that made junior officers instinctively step aside. Webb swallowed nervously. "Sir, the system identified the aircraft's transponder pattern as Storm Rider." All color drained from Morrison's face. He moved to Webb's station with focused urgency, the kind of movement that spoke of someone who had just received impossible news. "Where is that signal coming from?" "The civilian aircraft, sir," Webb replied. "The Cirrus SR22 that's currently being intercepted." Morrison pushed past Shaw to the communication station, his movements sharp and decisive. Years of retirement seemed to fall away as he assumed the bearing of an active commander responding to a crisis that only he fully understood. "Patch me through to the intercept team immediately," Morrison ordered. Shaw stepped forward, his face flushed with frustration at having his operation interrupted by forces beyond his understanding. "Colonel, with all due respect, this is my intercept. The aircraft has violated restricted airspace and failed to comply with lawful military orders." Morrison turned to face him, and Shaw was struck by the intensity in the older man's eyes, the look of someone who had commanded operations that existed beyond normal military channels. "Major, you don't understand what you're dealing with," Morrison said quietly. "If that truly is Storm Rider, you need to stand down immediately." "Stand down?" Shaw protested. "That's absurd. Colonel, this aircraft has been in restricted airspace for over 20 minutes and has ignored every directive we've given." But Morrison was already reaching for the microphone, his movements carrying the reflexes of someone who had spent decades managing crisis situations, where seconds could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. "Lieutenant Cross, this is Colonel Morrison. Verify identification protocol, Sierra Charlie 7. High above the Snake River Valley, Amanda heard the conflicting orders with growing confusion. Military protocol demanded she follow her commanding officer's instructions, but Colonel Morrison's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone operating under classified parameters that superseded normal chain of command. "Copy that, Colonel," Amanda responded, implementing Sierra Charlie 7 verification. She switched to a specialized frequency and broadcast the verification request to the Cirrus. What happened next would shatter every assumption about civilian aviation and reveal that some legends were far more real than anyone had imagined. In response to Amanda's verification signal, Victoria Kane executed a series of maneuvers that defied every limitation of civilian aircraft. The Cirrus performed movements that should have been impossible for the airframe, a complex aerial pattern that spoke of skills developed far beyond any commercial training program. Amanda's breath caught as she recognized the sequence. The precision was extraordinary, like watching a master artist work with tools that should have been inadequate for such artistry. "Control, the civilian aircraft is performing the Thunder Valley sequence," Amanda reported, her voice tight with disbelief. "I've only seen that pattern in classified training footage from advanced combat schools. The Thunder Valley sequence, a complex flight pattern developed for special operations, pilots operating in mountainous terrain under enemy fire. It had never been taught outside the most elite circles of military aviation, and certainly never to civilian pilots. In the control center, Major Shaw watched the radar track with mounting frustration and confusion. His orderly world of protocols and procedures was colliding with something that existed outside normal military channels. But Colonel Morrison was already reaching for the emergency communication line, his fingers punching in codes that bypassed normal security protocols and connected directly to the highest levels of military command. "This is Morrison, authorization November Delta 74, priority Omega," he spoke into the secure line. Storm Rider is active. Repeat. Storm Rider has returned. The implications of those words would soon transform a routine airspace violation into a national security crisis that reached the highest levels of government. Because Victoria Kane hadn't returned after 12 years, just to violate airspace restrictions, she had come back to prevent a catastrophe that could cripple the entire Pacific Northwest. The secure line connected immediately, indicating that Morrison's call had triggered the highest-level emergency response systems in the Pentagon. Within seconds, a crisp voice answered. Someone with authority far above Mountain Home Air Force Base was now listening to every word. Colonel Morrison, confirm status of Storm Rider identification, came the voice through encrypted channels that existed above normal military command structures. Positive identification confirmed, Morrison replied, his weathered face grave. As he watched the radar display showing the small civilian aircraft still flanked by two F-15s. She's executing signature patterns that only she could perform in a civilian aircraft. Major Shaw attempted to regain control of what he still considered his operation. Colonel, with all due respect, this is a clear security breach. The aircraft has violated restricted airspace and ignored multiple direct orders from military interceptors. Morrison held up a hand to silence Shaw while maintaining his conversation with the Pentagon. Request immediate escalation to defense. Secretary level. This is not a standard intercept situation. Suddenly, every screen in the control center flickered as emergency override protocols activated throughout the base. A new video feed appeared on the main display, transmitted through channels that bypassed every normal security level at Mountain Home. The face that appeared belonged to General Helen Reeves, Joint Chiefs Representative, her stern expression making it clear that this was far from a routine call. Colonel Morrison, is the identification confirmed beyond any doubt? General Reeves demanded without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. Positive, General. It's her signature flight pattern. No one else could execute those maneuvers in a civilian aircraft of that class. Shaw stepped into view of the camera, his face flushed with controlled anger and confusion. General Reeves, with all due respect, this is clearly a security breach. The aircraft has violated restricted airspace and ignored lawful orders from military interceptors. Protocol clearly states, Major Shaw. General Reeves interrupted with surgical precision. You will stand down immediately. This operation is now classified Priority Omega under direct presidential authority. Shaw felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Priority Omega was reserved for threats to national security that superseded every normal protocol in the book. With all due respect, General, this is a single civilian aircraft. Major. Reeves cut him off again, her tone leaving no room for argument. This comes directly from the Secretary of Defense. Stand down and transfer operational control to Colonel Morrison immediately. The general turned her attention to the communications officer. Broadcast on all military frequencies. Abort intercept mission. Escort Storm Rider to secure landing area. VIP Protocol Omega in effect immediately. The control center erupted in controlled chaos. Junior personnel looked confused while older officers exchanged glances of recognition and deep concern. Names like Storm Rider existed in the whispered legends of special operations, stories that were told in classified briefings but never officially confirmed. High above the Snake River Valley, Amanda Cross heard the new orders with complete disbelief. Escort Storm Rider to VIP Protocol Omega? She had never heard of any civilian aircraft receiving VIP status, especially one that had been violating restricted airspace for the better part of an hour. She looked across at the Cirrus, studying its pilot with new eyes. The woman met her gaze steadily, her expression revealing nothing of the secrets she carried. Yet somehow, in that moment of eye contact across the vastness of the Idaho sky, Amanda felt she was in the presence of something extraordinary. This wasn't just a civilian who had wandered into restricted airspace. This was someone whose very existence had triggered emergency protocols at the highest levels of government. "That's Storm Rider," Amanda whispered to herself, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of her cockpit. Back in the control center, the atmosphere had shifted from routine operations to crisis management. Officers rushed between stations while communications personnel worked to establish secure channels with multiple government agencies. At the center of this controlled storm stood Colonel Morrison, his decades of experience in special operations, making him the natural coordinator for a situation that existed outside normal military procedures. Sergeant Webb, still monitoring. The radar displays called out with professional precision despite his obvious bewilderment. "Sir, Storm Rider is adjusting course toward landing approach. She's following our vectors perfectly." Morrison nodded, moving to the communication station with the efficient movements of someone returning to familiar territory. "Lieutenant Cross, guide Storm Rider to landing pad Bravo 7. Full security protocol. No ground personnel except those on the authorized list." "Roger that, Colonel," Amanda responded, adjusting her 15's position to establish proper escort formation. Escort formation established. Eta to Bravo 7, 12 minutes. As the small formation descended toward Mountain Home Air Force Base, Morrison turned to address Major Shaw, whose expression showed a mixture of professional frustration and growing understanding that he was witnessing something far beyond his normal experience. "Major, I need you to clear landing pad Bravo 7 and establish a security perimeter," Morrison instructed. "No one gets within 500 yards without my personal authorization." Shaw straightened, his military training overriding his confusion. "Yes, sir. What level of security are we implementing?" "Maximum," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Treat this as a visit from someone whose security classification is above your clearance level." The doors to the control center opened again as Intelligence Director Nicole Pierce entered, carrying a sealed metallic briefcase that immediately caught Morrison's attention. At 48, Pierce moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling information that could destabilize governments if it fell into the wrong hands. "You got here quickly," Morrison observed, studying Pierce's grim expression. "I was already en route when the system alert triggered," Pierce replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been expecting this moment for years. "Certain designations automatically notify me when they appear in any military system." She paused, meeting Morrison's eyes with the look of someone who understood the full implications of what was happening. "Is it really her?" Morrison nodded grimly. "She's performing maneuvers only she could execute in that aircraft. After 12 years, Storm Rider is coming home." Major Shaw looked between the two senior officers, his frustration mounting as he realized how much was happening beyond his knowledge and security clearance. "Would someone please explain who exactly is in that aircraft? What makes this pilot so significant that we're implementing presidential-level security protocols?" General Reeves' voice cut through the room from the main screen. "Major Shaw, what you're about to learn is classified above top secret. 12 years ago, the Air Force had a special operations pilot whose skills exceeded anything we had seen before or since. Her call sign was Storm Rider." Shaw's expression showed his struggle to process this information. "I've never heard of any such pilot in any official records." "You wouldn't have," Pierce said, placing her briefcase on the central table. "The program was compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels. Even acknowledging its existence was restricted to those with direct operational need to know." General Reeves continued from the screen, her expression growing more serious. "Storm Rider disappeared 12 years ago after a mission that went catastrophically wrong. At least, according to official records. Her status has been classified ever since. On the radar display, They watched as the small Cirrus executed another series of precise maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of what civilian aircraft should be capable of achieving. Each movement was calculated and perfect, demonstrating skills that transcended normal aviation training. "That's her confirmation signature," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and deep concern. Only she could fly like that. As the aircraft continued its approach to Mountain Home, everyone in the control center began to understand that they were witnessing the return of someone who had been erased from official records, but whose legend had lived on in the classified corners of military aviation. Victoria Kane was coming home after 12 years of exile. And whatever had forced her to emerge from the shadows was significant enough to override every protocol in the book. Director Pierce placed her palm on a biometric scanner embedded in her briefcase. After a moment of electronic verification, the case unlocked with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing a single digital tablet and a specialized cryptographic key that resembled no standard military equipment. "General, requesting permission to access Storm Rider operational files," Pierce said formally, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal secrets that had been buried for over a decade. "Permission granted," General Reeves replied from the main screen. "Security override Alpha 9 Tango authorized." Pierce inserted the cryptographic key into the tablet, then entered a complex sequence of commands that required both advanced encryption knowledge and physical manipulation of the device. The main display in the control center switched from General Reeves' feed to a classified file interface that Major Shaw had never seen before. The heading simply read, "Operation Thunder. Valley, Storm Rider, primary asset, classification level, beyond top secret." A photograph appeared of a younger Victoria Kane in military dress uniform, receiving a medal from a general whose face was deliberately obscured in the image. But it was the personnel file that made everyone in the room fall silent. Her flight performance metrics pushed the boundaries of what seemed physically possible for any human pilot. "This is impossible," Shaw muttered, scanning the performance data displayed across multiple screens. "No pilot could achieve these scores." "She did," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge. "I was her commanding officer for 2 years before she was recruited for specialized operations." The screen changed to aerial footage of what appeared to be a combat extraction mission in mountainous terrain. An unmarked aircraft, a modified military transport that had been stripped down for maximum performance, executed impossible maneuvers through heavy anti-aircraft fire, landing briefly on what couldn't even generously be called a runway, then taking off again with remarkable speed despite being visibly overloaded with passengers. "Operation Thunder Valley," Pierce narrated as the classified footage played. 12 years ago, 300 American contractors were being held hostage in a location deemed impossible to reach by conventional rescue operations. Standard military assessment put casualty rates for any rescue attempt at 95%. Morrison leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense as he watched the footage of missions he had helped plan. Storm Rider volunteered for a solo extraction operation using modified civilian aircraft to avoid detection by enemy radar systems. "Solo extraction with 300 hostages?" Shaw asked incredulously, his understanding of military logistics struggling to process what he was hearing. "She made 11 trips over 3 days under continuous enemy fire," Morrison explained, his voice holding a note of pride despite the grim circumstances. "Flying routes that no other pilot would attempt. Most of our flight instructors said it was suicide." The room fell silent as they watched the classified footage of those extraction flights aircraft, performing maneuvers that seemed to defy both physics and pilot limitations. Victoria Kane had flown missions that redefined what was possible in aviation, pushing both herself and her aircraft beyond every known boundary. As the implications of what they were witnessing began to sink in, Major Shaw found himself asking the question that everyone was thinking: but no one wanted to voice. If Storm Rider was this legendary, why was she erased from all records? What happened 12 years ago? The answer came from an unexpected source. The door to the control center opened again, and Secretary of Defense Michael Brennan entered, flanked by security personnel. Tall and imposing at 62, Brennan moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to crisis management at the highest levels of government. "Mr. Secretary," General Reeves acknowledged from the screen. "I wasn't aware you were en route." "I wasn't until 40 minutes ago," Brennan replied, his expression grave. "When Storm Rider's signature appeared in our systems, it triggered silent alert that notifies only 3 people in the entire government." His gaze swept the room, taking in the assembled personnel with the calculating look of someone assessing security risks and potential vulnerabilities. Pierce manipulated the display to show communication records and incident reports from 12 years ago. The documents painted a disturbing picture of what had happened following Operation Thunder Valley's success. Victoria began questioning inconsistencies in the intelligence that led to the hostage situation, Pierce explained, highlighting specific communications that showed a pattern of investigation and growing suspicion. She believed the entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. Compromised how? Shaw asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand the gravity of what he was learning. She discovered evidence that the hostage situation had been engineered, Morrison said quietly. That someone within our own intelligence apparatus had deliberately created the crisis to force a specific military response. Brennan stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been involved in the original decisions. 12 years ago, I was the Deputy Director of Intelligence who received Victoria's concerns about Operation Thunder Valley. I didn't act quickly enough on her information." The secretary paused, looking at the classified footage still playing on the main screen. By the time I realized she was right, she had already received credible threats against her life from within our own government. "So she disappeared," Shaw said, the pieces finally beginning to come together. "Official records state she was killed." "In a training accident," Morrison corrected. "But her body was never recovered. In reality, she went underground after discovering that the network she had uncovered reached much higher than anyone had imagined." General Reeves' voice cut through the growing tension in the room. "The question now is why she's surfacing after 12 years of complete silence. If Storm Rider is taking the risk of exposure, something catastrophic is imminent." On the radar display, the Cirrus SR22 was now on final approach to Mountain Home Air Force Base, still flanked by the 2 F-15s in perfect escort formation. Security teams had moved into position around landing pad Bravo 7, creating a perimeter that would protect whatever secrets Victoria Kane was about to reveal. Pierce checked her secure communications device, her expression becoming even more serious. "I'm receiving reports of unusual activity across multiple intelligence networks. Coordinated movements that match patterns from 12 years ago. The same patterns that preceded Operation Thunder Valley," Morrison realized, his face going pale. As the implications became clear, Brennan moved to the communication station, his movements sharp and decisive. "Patch me through to the landing pad. I need to speak with Storm Rider the moment she touches down." The video feed from the landing area showed ground crews preparing for an arrival that was unprecedented in the base's history. Military personnel, who had heard whispers about Storm Rider throughout their careers, were about to witness the return of someone who had become a legend. "Lieutenant," Amanda Cross's voice came through the communication system, professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Control, Storm Rider is on final approach. Landing sequence initiated." As the small Cirrus touched down on the runway at Mountain Home Air Force Base, everyone in the control center understood that they were witnessing the moment that would change everything. Victoria Kane had emerged from 12 years of exile, not for recognition or vindication, but because she had discovered something that threatened the very foundations of American national security. The legend was about to become reality once again. And with her return came the promise of answers to questions that had been classified for over a decade, along with new threats that could dwarf anything they had faced before. Whatever had driven Storm Rider to risk exposure after so many years of successful concealment was about to be revealed. And based on her track record, it was going to be significant enough to reshape their understanding of the dangers facing the country. The Cirrus SR22 taxied to a complete stop on landing pad Bravo 7, its engines winding down as security teams moved into final positions around the isolated area. The two F-15s that had escorted the aircraft positioned themselves at either end of the runway, their engines still running as a precautionary measure that spoke to the unprecedented nature of this arrival. A small honor guard had formed spontaneously as word spread through Mountain Home Air Force Base that someone extraordinary had arrived. Though most of the personnel had no idea who they were about to meet, there was something in the moment that demanded respect, a recognition that they were witnessing the return of someone whose very presence had triggered the highest levels of government response. The aircraft door opened, and Victoria Kane emerged, carrying a weathered leather briefcase that looked like it had traveled through more conflicts than most military personnel would see in a lifetime. She paused at the top of the aircraft steps, surveying the assembled personnel with a measured gaze that seemed to catalog every detail of the security arrangements and personnel positions. Though dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, boots, and a leather jacket that bore no military insignia, her posture and bearing were unmistakably those of someone who had spent years in command situations where lives depended on split-second decisions. Lieutenant Amanda Cross had climbed down from her F-15 and now stood at attention, offering a crisp salute as Victoria descended the steps. Other pilots and ground crew followed suit, though none of them could have known exactly who they were honoring. There was something in Victoria's presence that commanded respect, a quiet authority that transcended rank or official recognition. Victoria acknowledged the salutes with a subtle nod, her expression remaining composed despite what must have been the emotional weight of returning to a world she had been forced to abandon 12 years ago. She walked directly toward the camera that was transmitting live to the control center, her movements purposeful and confident. "Storm Rider secure," she said simply, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had gone too long without using official military communications protocols. From the control center, Secretary Brennan leaned toward the microphone. "Confirm. Secure, Storm Rider. Stand by for escort to Briefing Room Alpha." Turning to the others in the control center, Brennan's expression was grave. 12 years ago, I was the intelligence officer who received her concerns about Operation Thunder Valley. I didn't act quickly enough on her information. By the time I realized she was right about the scope of the conspiracy, she had already gone underground. Major Shaw, still struggling to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing, asked the question that everyone was thinking. What exactly was she right about, Mr. Secretary? Brennan's answer sent a chill through everyone in the room. That there was a coordinated network of operatives within our intelligence apparatus working directly against American interests. She had uncovered evidence that certain crisis situations were being engineered to force specific military responses, creating geopolitical pressure points that could be exploited by hostile forces. Morrison nodded grimly, his expression showing the weight of classified knowledge he had carried for over a decade. And now she's back, which means something similar is happening again. The video feed from the landing pad showed Victoria being escorted to a secure vehicle by the highest level security detail available on the base. The convoy that formed around her was the type typically reserved for visits from foreign heads of state or cabinet-level officials. "Bring Lieutenant Cross to the briefing as well," Brennan instructed, watching as Amanda continued to observe the proceedings with obvious fascination. If Storm Rider chose her as escort pilot, there's a reason. Victoria Kane doesn't make arbitrary decisions. As the secure vehicles disappeared toward the classified briefing facilities, the assembled officers began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than an unusual airspace violation. Storm Rider had returned from exile, and with her came intelligence that could reshape their understanding of threats to national security. Director Pierce was already manipulating her tablet, bringing up real-time intelligence feeds from across the country. Mr. Secretary, we're seeing coordinated unusual activity across multiple agencies. Communication patterns that match what Victoria identified 12 years ago. Show me, Brennan ordered, moving to examine the data Pierce was displaying. Intelligence patterns that appeared on screen were subtle but unmistakable to trained analysts. Financial transactions that followed specific rhythms. Personnel movements that created temporary vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, communication. Intercepts that suggested coordination at levels that should have been impossible for hostile operatives to achieve. This is why she came back, Morrison realized, studying the data with growing alarm. She's been monitoring these patterns from outside the system, probably for years. Colonel Morrison turned to address the assembled personnel, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the full scope of what they were facing. People, what you're about to be briefed on is classified at levels that supersede normal security clearances. What Storm Rider has discovered could affect national security at the most fundamental levels. 20 minutes later, they had assembled in Briefing Room Alpha, the most secure facility on the base. The room's walls were lined with advanced electronic countermeasures designed to prevent any form of surveillance or communication breach. Victoria sat calmly at the center of the conference table, her weathered briefcase placed before her like a weapon waiting to be deployed. She looked remarkably composed for someone who had just ended 12 years of self-imposed exile. But there was something in her eyes, a hardness that spoke of years spent in situations where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. Secretary Brennan entered last, sealing the door behind him with biometric locks that would prevent any unauthorized access. The room fell silent as he approached Victoria, and to everyone's surprise, he briefly embraced her. "You were right," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old regrets and missed opportunities. "I should have listened years ago when you first brought me your concerns." Victoria's expression softened momentarily, revealing a glimpse of the person beneath the professional facade that had been hardened by years of operating in the shadows. "We don't have time for regrets, Michael. It's happening again, and this time the scope is much larger." She opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency and removed a small data drive, which she inserted into the room's secure computer system. The screens around the room illuminated with complex patterns of data communications intercepts, financial transactions, personnel movements, and infrastructure vulnerabilities that painted a picture of coordinated action across multiple states. 3 days ago, a specific pattern of security breaches began across multiple government agencies. Victoria explained, her voice steady and clinical despite the enormous implications of what she was revealing. "It's the same signature I identified before Operation Thunder Valley. The same network that buried that investigation is active again, operating under different names and cover identities, but following identical operational patterns." Lieutenant Amanda Cross, who had been brought to the briefing as instructed, leaned forward with the intense focus of someone trying to understand something that could change everything she thought she knew about national security. Major Shaw, his earlier frustration now completely replaced by professional concern, asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. "How could you possibly have this intelligence from outside official channels?" Victoria met his gaze directly, her expression carrying the confidence of someone who had spent 12 years perfecting survival techniques that most intelligence professionals never learned. "Because I never really left the system, Major," she replied, I just moved to its shadows and learned to see patterns that are invisible when you're inside the bureaucracy that's been compromised. The implications of her words settled over the room like a cold wind. For 12 years, while everyone believed Storm Rider was dead, she had been conducting her own intelligence operation, tracking the very network that had forced her into exile. And now she was ready to reveal what she had discovered: intelligence that would soon prove that the greatest threats to American security weren't coming from foreign enemies, but from an organized conspiracy that had been operating within their own government for over a decade. Victoria manipulated the data display with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years analyzing these patterns in isolation. The connections that emerged on the screens around the room were subtle but unmistakable, a web of coordination that spanned multiple government agencies and reached into the highest levels of infrastructure management. The network responsible for Operation Thunder Valley never disbanded, Victoria explained, highlighting specific communication intercepts and financial transactions. They went deeper underground, recruited new assets, and expanded their operational scope. What I'm showing you represents 12 years of systematic infiltration into America's most critical systems. She brought up a map of the Pacific Northwest, showing power distribution networks, communication hubs, and transportation infrastructure. Red markers indicated points of vulnerability that had been carefully mapped and prepared for exploitation. Their current target isn't a single hostage situation that can be resolved with military action, Victoria continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years preparing for this briefing. They're planning coordinated attacks on power grid infrastructure across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. When those grids fail, emergency protocols will activate that require federal oversight for repair operations. Director Pierce leaned forward, her intelligence background allowing her to immediately grasp the implications, creating opportunities for infiltration rather than just sabotage. Not just infiltration, Victoria corrected, bringing up detailed schematics of power station security systems. Permanent access. The repair teams they've positioned include compromised personnel who will install hardware designed to give them backdoor control over the electrical infrastructure indefinitely. The room fell silent as the scope of the threat became clear. Control over power infrastructure would give hostile operatives unprecedented leverage over economic stability, emergency services, and military operations across the entire Pacific Northwest. Lieutenant Amanda Cross, who had remained quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke. "How long do we have before they implement this plan?" Victoria checked her watch with the precision of someone who had been tracking a countdown for months. 36 hours until the first coordinated grid failure is triggered. The attacks are designed to cascade, creating the appearance of system overload rather than deliberate sabotage. Secretary Brennan stood, moving to the secure communication station, with the urgent movements of someone who understood that every minute of delay could have catastrophic consequences. "I need to brief the president immediately. This takes priority over everything else on the national security agenda." "There's more," Victoria said, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room focus their complete attention on her. She removed another device from her briefcase, a specialized tablet with encrypted storage that looked like it had been custom-built for intelligence operations that existed outside normal government channels. "The network responsible for this operation has been embedding assets for nearly 2 decades, Victoria explained, activating the tablet to display an organizational chart that showed connections reaching into positions that made several people in the room visibly uncomfortable. "Every compromised technician leads to a recruiter, every recruiter to a handler, every handler to someone higher in the organization." The chart showed names and positions that represented a staggering scope of potential compromise, reaching into agencies that were supposed to be beyond infiltration. Financial regulators, infrastructure managers, emergency response coordinators. and military logistics personnel, all connected by patterns of communication and coordination that painted a picture of systematic long-term planning. "This isn't just about stopping a power grid attack," Victoria said, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "It's about exposing the network that has been operating within our system since before Operation Thunder Valley. Many of these individuals occupy positions of significant authority in critical infrastructure management." Major Shaw studied the organizational chart with growing alarm, recognizing several names from agencies he had worked with during his career. Some of these positions, if they're compromised, it means our response to any crisis could be anticipated and countered before we even implement it. "Which is exactly what happened during Operation Thunder Valley," Victoria replied. "And it's what they're counting on happening again during the grid attacks." She closed the tablet and returned it to her briefcase, then stood with the decisive movement of someone transitioning from briefing to action phase. "I'll need a small operational team, maximum security clearance, and complete autonomy to implement countermeasures." "You'll have whatever you need," Brennan promised without hesitation. "This operation takes priority over every other mission currently active." Morrison leaned forward, his expression showing concern that went beyond professional worry. "Victoria, you're talking about going into the field personally. After 12 years underground, exposing yourself to direct operational risk." Victoria's expression became thoughtful, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped, revealing something more personal beneath the surface. "Some missions never end, Frank. I made promises to the people we lost in Operation Thunder Valley. This is part of keeping those promises." She outlined her strategy for countering the impending attacks with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years developing contingency plans. Her approach was multifaceted: simultaneous operations to prevent the grid failures, capture the compromised personnel, and trace their connections back through the network to identify the higher-level coordination. "We'll position counter-surveillance teams at each targeted facility," Victoria explained, manipulating the displays to show optimal positioning for intervention teams. "When the saboteurs move to implement their attacks, we'll turn their own operation against them, using their planned infiltration points as traps to capture personnel and extract intelligence about the broader network." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. Rather than simply preventing the attacks, Victoria intended to use them as an opportunity to dismantle the entire conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows for 2 decades. Director Pierce reviewed the operational timeline with the focused attention of someone who understood the complexity of coordinating multiple simultaneous intelligence operations. "The logistics alone will require resources from agencies that may have been compromised, which is why we operate with minimal personnel and maximum compartmentalization," Victoria replied. "Trust only the people in this room and the teams they personally vet through channels that bypass normal security protocols." Amanda Cross, who had been absorbing the magnitude of what was being planned, asked the question that had been troubling her since the briefing began. Why come forward now? After 12 years of successful concealment, why risk exposure? Victoria paused in her preparations, her expression becoming contemplative. "Because some promises once made must be kept regardless of the cost. And because this network has grown beyond what anyone imagined. If we don't stop them now, the next operation won't target regional infrastructure. It will target national systems that could cripple the entire country." Outside the briefing room windows, the Idaho mountains stood silent against the darkening sky, much as they had 12 years ago when Victoria Kane first disappeared into their shadows. Somewhere beyond those peaks, hostile forces were preparing to strike at the heart of American infrastructure, but they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed Storm Rider was truly dead. As the team prepared to deploy, Victoria removed one final item from her briefcase. It was a small fabric patch bearing the stylized eagle insignia in deep blue, Her original squadron patch from before the calcine became classified and everything went underground. "This belonged to my original squadron," she said, offering it to Amanda, before everything became compartmentalized and classified beyond recognition. Amanda accepted it with surprised reverence, understanding the significance of the gesture. "I've studied every unclassified record of special operations. Aviation. There's nothing in current training that approaches what you accomplished." "The records don't matter," Victoria replied, glancing toward the window where military aircraft could be seen preparing for departure. "The mission does. It always has, and it always will." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn broke over Mountain Home Air Force Base, casting long shadows across the tarmac, where a small team gathered around a sleek military transport aircraft. The past 8 hours had been a whirlwind of preparation personnel vetted through channels that bypassed normal security protocols, equipment requisitioned from classified stockpiles, and plans finalized for an operation that officially didn't exist. At the center of this controlled storm stood Victoria Kane, now wearing a flight suit that bore no insignia or rank markings. The anonymity seemed fitting for someone who had existed as a ghost for 12 years. She studied a tablet displaying real-time satellite imagery of power stations across the Pacific Northwest, occasionally making notations with the precise, economical movements of someone accustomed to operating under extreme time pressure. Major Shaw approached carrying a secure communications package, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional respect and the exhaustion that came from all-night briefings and security preparations. "The encrypted channels you requested are active," he reported. "Direct links to Secretary Brennan and General Reeves, bypassing all standard command structures." "Thank you, Major," Victoria replied without looking up from her tablet. "Has the reconnaissance data from the Portland facility surveillance come through?" "Just arriving now." Lieutenant Cross brought it personally from her pre-dawn reconnaissance flight. Victoria nodded, finally meeting his gaze. Her expression held the focused intensity of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. "Your security protocols are impressive, Major. You run an efficient operation." The compliment, delivered without inflection, nonetheless seemed to ease some of the remaining tension between them. Shaw straightened slightly, recognizing professional acknowledgement from someone whose expertise was beyond question. "High praise coming from you, Miss Kane," he replied. "Lieutenant," she corrected mildly. "Secretary Brennan reinstated my commission at 03:00 hours this morning." Shaw looked surprised but recovered quickly. "Lieutenant Kane, my security teams remain at your disposal if you need additional support for the field operations." "This operation requires minimal personnel," Victoria responded, returning her attention to the tablet. "The fewer people involved, the less opportunity for compromise by the network we're targeting." As Shaw departed to coordinate final security measures, Lieutenant Amanda Cross approached carrying a data drive containing surveillance footage she had captured during her carefully planned reconnaissance mission. She had been assigned as Victoria's primary pilot for the operation, a role that both honored and terrified her, given the legendary reputation of the woman she would be supporting. "Portland facility surveillance complete," Amanda reported with professional precision. "I identified 4 maintenance vehicles with non-standard equipment modifications, exactly as you predicted." Victoria took the drive, her expression unchanged despite confirmation of her worst fears. "Show me the footage." Together, they reviewed the images Amanda had captured during her surveillance flight. The footage showed maintenance crews preparing for what appeared to be routine work at key power distribution nodes throughout the Portland metropolitan area. To an untrained observer, nothing would have seemed suspicious. "There," Victoria said, freezing a frame and zooming in on a technician's equipment case. The secondary compartment configuration. Standard repair kits don't have that additional storage space. Amanda studied the image, noting details she would never have identified without guidance from someone with Victoria's experience. I would never have recognized that as suspicious equipment modification. You weren't trained to identify sabotage equipment, Victoria replied simply. But you identified the vehicles and their positioning without any guidance from me. That shows exceptional situational awareness and tactical thinking. The subtle praise meant more to Amanda than she expected. Few pilots earned recognition from someone with Victoria's legendary reputation and operational experience. Permission to ask a question? Amanda said, using formal address despite their growing professional familiarity. Victoria glanced up, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. We're about to conduct an off-books counterintelligence operation that could determine the fate of regional infrastructure. I think we can dispense with some formalities. How did you survive for 12 years completely off the grid? Even with your skills, the resources required would be enormous. For a moment, it seemed Victoria might not answer. She continued reviewing the surveillance data, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. Just as Amanda had decided the question would be ignored, Victoria spoke quietly. I was never completely off the grid, she said. I created a network of alternative identities before I disappeared, established secure communication protocols with trusted contacts like Colonel Morrison, and prepared financial resources and accounts that wouldn't be monitored by standard intelligence oversight. Amanda's surprise must have shown on her face. The implications of maintaining contact with active military personnel while officially dead were staggering from both operational and legal perspectives. Morrison kept me informed about personnel changes, security upgrades, and potential allies, Victoria continued. And I had access to resources that most people don't realize exist. When you fly black operations missions for years, you learn which foreign accounts won't trigger monitoring systems. Before Amanda could process this information fully, Colonel Morrison himself approached. At 64, he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had endured more combat deployments than most people could imagine. But his eyes remained sharp and alert with the intensity of someone who understood the stakes of what they were attempting. The team is assembled, he announced. All personnel have been briefed on their need-to-know parameters. Victoria nodded approvingly. And the original Thunder Valley files? Secured in the aircraft safe as requested. Morrison confirmed. Intelligence Director Pierce joined them, completing the small circle of senior personnel who would coordinate the operation. We've identified the infiltration points at all 3 major power stations. If your timeline is correct, we have less than 30 hours before the first facility is compromised. The timeline is accurate, Victoria said with quiet certainty that brooked no argument. They'll move against the Portland grid first, creating a cascading failure that will trigger emergency protocols throughout Oregon and Washington when federal oversight teams are deployed to manage repair operations. The compromised technicians will access the main control systems. She pulled up a detailed schematic on the main display, showing the interconnected vulnerabilities that had been carefully mapped over months of surveillance and preparation. We'll deploy 3 teams simultaneously. Director Pierce will coordinate intelligence gathering from here with Secretary Brennan. Colonel Morrison will take Team 2 to secure the Seattle area facilities. Lieutenant Cross and I will personally handle the Portland station where the initial attack is planned. Morrison's expression showed concern that went beyond professional. Worry about operational risk. Victoria, you're going into the field yourself. After 12 years underground, you're exposing yourself to direct operational danger. I spent 12 years preparing for this moment, Victoria replied, her voice carrying absolute conviction. I didn't come back to coordinate from behind a desk while other people take the risks. Secretary Brennan's voice came through the secure communication system, transmitted through encrypted channels that bypassed all normal military communications infrastructure. All teams be advised, presidential authorization confirmed. This operation now has Omega-level priority with unlimited resource authorization. Victoria acknowledged the message, then addressed the assembled team with the authority of someone who had commanded operations that existed beyond official recognition. This isn't just about stopping power grid attacks. It's about exposing a network that has operated within our systems for nearly 2 decades, with operatives in positions of significant authority throughout critical infrastructure management. She paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering her final instruction with the gravity of someone who had learned hard lessons about trust during her years in exile. Trust only the personnel on your immediate team and the people they have personally vetted through secure channels. Assume that normal communication systems have been compromised. The small group dispersed to their assigned positions, each carrying the weight of knowledge that could reshape American national security if they succeeded or devastate regional infrastructure if they failed. Amanda followed Victoria toward their waiting aircraft, a modified transport with enhanced stealth capabilities that would allow them to approach their target without detection by either military or civilian radar systems. "Lieutenant," Victoria said as they walked across the tarmac toward their aircraft, "I reviewed your complete flight records last night. Your instincts in the cockpit are exceptional, which is why you're taking point on the most critical phase of this mission." "Thank you, ma'am," Amanda replied, caught off guard by unexpected commendation from someone whose approval meant everything in military aviation circles. "When we reach the Portland facility, we'll be operating against hostiles who may have legitimate credentials and security clearance," Victoria continued. "Your ability to identify anomalous behavior and tactical threats could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." As they boarded the aircraft and moved directly to the cockpit where sophisticated avionics awaited them, Amanda was surprised when Victoria took the co-pilot's seat, despite clearly outranking her. "You'll be pilot in command," Victoria explained. Noting Amanda's confusion, "I need to coordinate real-time intelligence during the flight, and you're more current on this aircraft systems than I am." As they completed pre-flight checks with the efficiency of experienced professionals, Amanda couldn't resist asking the question that had been burning in her mind since the previous day's revelations. "Why did you choose to return now? After 12 years of successful concealment, why risk exposure?" Victoria was silent for several moments, her hands moving automatically through the startup sequence while she considered her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Amanda had yet heard it, carrying emotions that had been carefully controlled throughout the operational planning. "Because some missions never end, Lieutenant. I made promises to the people we lost in Operation Thunder Valley, and this is part of keeping those promises. But more than that, this network has grown beyond what anyone imagined. If we don't stop them now, the next operation won't target regional infrastructure. It will target national systems that could cripple the entire country." The engines roared to life, drowning out any possibility of further conversation as they prepared for takeoff. But in that moment of shared understanding, Amanda realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the return of a legendary pilot, but the completion of a mission that had begun 12 years earlier in the mountains of a foreign country. As their aircraft lifted into the clear morning sky, carrying them toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of Pacific Northwest infrastructure, both women understood they were flying into history. The only question was whether they would emerge as heroes or casualties in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. 4 hours later, their aircraft touched down at a remote airstrip 30 miles from the Portland Energy Distribution Center. The facility loomed on the horizon like a fortress of steel and concrete, its critical importance to the regional power grid making it a perfect target for the kind of sophisticated attack Victoria had predicted. A nondescript SUV awaited, them arranged through channels that bypass standard military logistics. As they drove toward the facility, Victoria briefed Amanda on the final details of their infiltration approach. The compromised technicians believe their operation is undetected, she explained, studying real-time intelligence feeds on a secure tablet. We'll use that assumption against them. Our credentials identify us as emergency preparedness auditors from the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest Regional Office. Won't they verify our identities through standard channels? Amanda asked, noting the sophisticated security measures surrounding the power station as it came into view. The credentials are genuine, Victoria replied. Secretary Brennan arranged them personally through compartmented channels that exist above normal bureaucratic verification. If they run background checks, the system will confirm our covers completely. The Portland Energy Distribution Center appeared before them, a sprawling complex of transformers, switching yards, and control buildings surrounded by multiple layers of security fencing. 4 maintenance vehicles were parked near the main entrance, the same vehicles Amanda had identified during her reconnaissance flight the previous morning. At the security checkpoint, Victoria presented their credentials with casual confidence that suggested years of experience in covert operations. The guards scrutinized their documentation carefully before making the call to verify their arrival with facility management. After a brief conversation that seemed to satisfy security protocols, he waved them through with professional courtesy. Unscheduled audit team, he explained to his colleague. Department of Energy is conducting emergency response protocol verification. Inside the facility, Victoria and Amanda were directed to the main control room by personnel, who seemed genuinely surprised by their arrival but accepted their presence as part of the bureaucratic oversight that occasionally descended on critical infrastructure facilities without warning. They moved through the complex with purposeful efficiency, noting the positions of security cameras, personnel locations, and potential exit routes while maintaining their cover as routine government auditors. As they passed the maintenance team working on a critical transformer array, Victoria murmured quietly to Amanda, "Third technician from the left." The case at his feet contains more sophisticated equipment than standard repair tools, Amanda observed, without appearing to stare, noting subtle differences in the man's equipment and behavior that set him apart from his colleagues. His movements were more precise, his awareness of surroundings more acute than typical maintenance personnel. "How do we proceed?" Amanda asked quietly. "We complete our audit inspection first," Victoria replied. "Establish our cover thoroughly, then coordinate simultaneous action with Morrison's team at the Seattle facilities." In the main control room, they were greeted by the facility manager, a harried-looking man named Peterson who seemed annoyed by the unannounced inspection but professionally cooperative. "We weren't informed of any Department of Energy audit," Peterson complained, reviewing their credentials again with obvious suspicion. "That's rather the point of emergency preparedness assessment," Victoria replied smoothly, her cover identity perfectly maintained. "Real emergencies don't schedule appointments or provide advance notice." For the next 90 minutes, they conducted a meticulous inspection that would have satisfied any legitimate audit requirements. They requested access to security protocols, backup power systems, emergency response procedures, and personnel records, all while Victoria made mental notes of irregularities that confirmed her worst fears. She observed security cameras with adjusted viewing angles that created blind spots, backup generators with modified fuel lines that could be compromised remotely, and communication systems with non-standard installations that suggested unauthorized access capabilities. Each anomaly painted a picture of systematic preparation for the coordinated attack she had predicted. "Everything appears to be in order," Victoria finally announced to Peterson with bureaucratic satisfaction. "We just need to review the maintenance logs for the past 2 weeks to complete our assessment." As Peterson retrieved the requested documents, Victoria received a secure message from Morrison through encrypted channels that bypassed all normal communication systems. Team 2 in position at Seattle facility. Compromise confirmed. Standing by for synchronized action. Understood, Victoria replied softly into her communication device. Execute on my signal in 15 minutes. She turned to Amanda with a subtle hand signal that had been pre-arranged during their flight preparation. 12 minutes. Peterson returned with the maintenance logs, still grumbling about bureaucratic oversight and unscheduled inspections that disrupted normal facility operations. Victoria reviewed them with apparent thoroughness, while discreetly checking her watch and monitoring her secure communication device. Mr. Peterson, she said calmly, could you explain why Maintenance Team Charlie has accessed the primary transformer array 4 times this week when standard protocols require only monthly inspections? Peterson frowned, leaning over to examine the logs with genuine confusion about the irregularity. That can't be right. Let me review those numbers again. As he bent closer to study the documents, Victoria smoothly removed a small electronic device from her pocket and placed it beneath the main control console. The device would override security systems and broadcast emergency alerts to coordinate with Morrison's team and Pierce's intelligence operation. Actually, Mr. Peterson, Victoria said, straightening with a subtle but complete change in demeanor from bureaucratic inspector to military commander, I think we need to discuss a more urgent matter. This facility has been compromised by hostile operatives. Peterson stared at her in complete confusion, his mind struggling to process the dramatic shift in circumstances that had transformed a routine audit into something that sounded like a national security crisis. What are you talking about? Peterson demanded. You can't just, Lieutenant, Victoria said calmly, using Amanda's military rank for the first time since they had arrived at the facility. Amanda moved with practiced efficiency, securing the control room doors and positioning herself to monitor both entrances while maintaining visual contact with the maintenance teams visible through the control room windows. Her training took over completely, transforming her from audit assistant to military operator in seconds. Outside the control room, alarms began to sound as Colonel Morrison's team executed their synchronized operation at the Seattle facility. The carefully coordinated response that Victoria had planned was unfolding exactly as designed, with precision timing that left no opportunity for the compromised operatives to communicate warnings or abort their mission. What's happening? Peterson demanded, his face paling as he realized the situation had moved far beyond his understanding or control. Your maintenance teams include infiltrators planning to sabotage the power grid, Victoria explained, activating the device she had placed under the console. Screens around the room suddenly displayed live feeds of the maintenance teams, now being surrounded by federal security personnel, responding to automated alerts. That's impossible, Peterson protested, gesturing toward the security monitors showing his own employees. Those teams have worked here for years. They all have security clearance and complete background verification. Yes, Victoria agreed grimly, watching as the coordinated operation unfolded with military precision. That's precisely the problem we're dealing with. Over the next 40 minutes, security teams coordinated by Morrison, Pierce, and federal agents apprehended the compromised technicians across all 3 targeted power stations simultaneously. The sabotage devices disguised as legitimate maintenance equipment were secured and isolated for detailed forensic analysis that would reveal the sophisticated nature of the planned attacks. As federal agents arrived to take custody of the suspects and secure the evidence that would expose the broader network, Victoria stood apart from the controlled chaos, watching the operation conclude with the same calm focus she had maintained throughout the mission. Amanda joined her, still processing the events that had unfolded with startling efficiency and precision. We stopped them this time. This time, Victoria replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that victories in covert operations were often temporary, and that the broader war continued beyond any single mission success. "What happens now?" Amanda asked, watching as the suspects were led away in restraints while forensic teams began the complex process of analyzing the sophisticated equipment that had been designed to cripple regional infrastructure. "Now we follow the connections," Victoria said, her eyes tracking the federal agents who were already beginning the intricate process of unraveling the network through interrogation and intelligence analysis. "Every compromised technician leads to a recruiter. Every recruiter leads to a handler. Every handler leads to someone higher in the organization." She turned to meet Amanda's gaze directly, her expression carrying the determination of someone who had spent 12 years preparing for this moment and understood that it was only the beginning of a much larger campaign. "This is why I came back. Amanda, this isn't a single mission that ends with arrests and congratulations. It's the beginning of a campaign that may take years to complete, but it's a campaign that will finally expose the network that has been operating in our shadows for nearly 2 decades. 1 week later, they gathered in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, where the full scope of what Victoria's operation had uncovered was finally becoming clear. The arrests at the 3 power facilities had been just the beginning. Each captured operative had provided intelligence that led to more arrests, more discoveries, and more connections in a network that seemed to reach into every critical infrastructure system in the Pacific Northwest. Secretary Brennan presided over the briefing, his expression grave as he reviewed reports that painted a picture of systematic infiltration that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. "The interrogation results have exceeded our worst-case scenarios," he announced to the assembled team. "We're looking at a coordinated network that has been placing operatives in critical positions for over 15 years. Director Pierce manipulated displays showing the expanding web of connections they had uncovered. Financial records, communication, intercepts, and personnel files created a pattern that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Victoria had been tracking from the shadows. Each arrest has led to an average of 3 additional suspects," Pierce reported. "We've identified compromised personnel in power companies, telecommunications infrastructure, transportation systems, and emergency services coordination centers across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California." Colonel Morrison, who had coordinated the Seattle operations, added his assessment with the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent decades in intelligence operations. "The level of coordination required for this network suggests backing by a sophisticated foreign intelligence service with unlimited resources and decades-long strategic planning." Victoria sat at the conference table, still wearing the civilian clothes she had worn during the operation, her weathered briefcase beside her. Though she had been officially reinstated to active duty, she seemed more comfortable operating outside the formal military structure that had failed to protect her 12 years earlier. The power grid attacks were just the beginning of their operational timeline, Victoria explained, bringing up classified documents she had obtained through channels that still remained outside official oversight. "We found evidence of planned attacks on water treatment facilities, communication networks, and transportation hubs scheduled over the next 18 months. Amanda Cross, who had been assigned to Victoria's new task force, reviewed the intelligence with growing alarm. "They were planning to systematically degrade infrastructure across the entire region." "Not degrade," Victoria corrected. "Control." Each attack was designed to force federal intervention, creating opportunities to insert more operatives into emergency response teams and repair operations. Within 2 years, they would have had backdoor access to every critical system in the Pacific Northwest. Major Shaw, who had been brought into the expanded investigation, studied personnel files that showed the sophistication of the network's recruitment and placement operations. "Some of these people have been in position for over a decade. Their security clearances, background checks, everything appears legitimate. Because it is legitimate, Morrison replied grimly. They didn't just infiltrate our systems, they became part of them. Many of these operatives were recruited while already in position, turned through a combination of financial incentives, personal compromises, and ideological manipulation. The briefing continued for 3 hours, each revelation more disturbing than the last. The network had tentacles that reached into state governments, federal agencies, and private corporations that managed critical infrastructure. Their operational security had been nearly perfect, with each cell knowing only what they needed to accomplish their specific mission. How did they avoid detection for so long? Amanda asked, studying communication intercepts that showed sophisticated encryption and operational security protocols. Victoria's expression became thoughtful as she considered the question. Because they understood something that our security apparatus doesn't want to acknowledge, that the greatest vulnerabilities in any system are the people you trust most. They recruited individuals who were already inside the security perimeter, people whose loyalty was never questioned, because they had passed every background check and security screening. Secretary Brennan stood, moving to the secure communication station where updates continued to arrive from field teams conducting arrests across 3 states. The President has authorized expansion of the investigation to a national level. We're seeing similar patterns in other regions that suggest this network extends far beyond the Pacific Northwest. How far? Morrison asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer would be significant. Preliminary analysis indicates potential compromise in at least 12 states, Pierce reported, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years in intelligence work and understood the implications of what they were uncovering. Power grids, water systems, telecommunications, transportation, all showing signs of coordinated preparation for systematic attack. The room fell silent as the true scope of the threat became clear. What had begun as an investigation into power grid vulnerabilities had revealed a network capable of crippling critical infrastructure across multiple regions of the United States. Victoria removed a final document from her briefcase, a handwritten analysis she had prepared during her 12 years of exile, tracking patterns and connections that had led to this moment. This is why I couldn't work through official channels, she explained. The network includes people in official channels. My investigation was only possible because I operated completely outside the system they had infiltrated. Amanda studied the document, noting the meticulous detail and years of careful observation that had gone into tracking the conspiracy. You've been preparing for this moment for 12 years. I've been preparing to finish what I started during Operation Thunder Valley, Victoria corrected. The network that compromised that mission never disappeared. They just went deeper underground and expanded their operations. Director Pierce activated a new display showing financial analysis. That revealed the true scope of the network's resources. We're tracking funding sources that connect to shell corporations in 7 countries, with total assets exceeding $200 million dedicated to this operation. $200 million to compromise American infrastructure. Sighed, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. The return on investment would have been incalculable, Morrison replied. Control over regional infrastructure would give hostile forces leverage over everything from economic stability to military readiness. Secretary Brennan returned to the conference table, his expression showing the weight of decisions that would affect national security policy for years to come. Victoria, I'm authorizing you to lead a new task force dedicated to identifying and neutralizing similar networks in other regions. You'll have unlimited resources and complete operational autonomy. Victoria was quiet for several moments, considering the offer with the careful thought of someone who had learned to distrust institutional promises. I'll accept, but with conditions. The task force operates outside normal bureaucratic channels. Reports directly to you and the President. and maintains complete compartmentalization from agencies that may have been compromised. Agreed, Brennan said without hesitation. Lieutenant Cross will serve as your deputy commander, with Morrison and Pierce providing senior advisory support. As the briefing concluded and team members began to disperse to their new assignments, Amanda approached Victoria with a question that had been troubling her since the operation's conclusion. Do you think we'll ever get them all? The network has been operating for decades. How do we know we've identified everyone? Victoria packed her briefcase with the methodical precision that had become second nature over years of operational security. We probably won't get them all, at least not immediately. But we've done something more important than capturing every operative. She closed the briefcase and stood, looking toward the window where military aircraft could be seen departing the Pentagon landing pad. We've proven that they can be detected, that their operational security isn't perfect, and that people like you are capable of identifying and stopping them. People like me? Amanda asked. People who can see patterns that others miss, who aren't blinded by the assumption that our systems are secure simply because they're supposed to be, Victoria replied. The next generation of officers who will continue this work long after I'm gone. As they prepared to leave the Pentagon and begin the next phase of their expanded mission, Victoria removed the small fabric patch she had given Amanda during their first operation, the Eagle insignia from her original squadron before. Everything became classified. Keep this, she said, not as a reminder of the past, but as a symbol of the mission that continues. Some battles end, but the mission to protect this country never does. Amanda accepted the patch with understanding that went beyond words. She was no longer just a fighter pilot who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation. She was part of a continuing mission that would define the rest of her career. Outside the Pentagon, the Virginia landscape stretched toward distant mountains that had kept their secrets for centuries. But today, some of those secrets had been revealed, and the work of protecting American infrastructure from those who would exploit its vulnerabilities continued. The network that had operated in shadows for nearly 2 decades had been exposed and partially dismantled. But Victoria Kane understood that the real victory wasn't in the arrests they had made or the attacks they had prevented. It was in the knowledge that the system could adapt, that threats could be identified, and that people like Amanda Cross would continue the mission long after Storm Rider finally returned to the shadows where legends belonged. 3 months later, Victoria's task force had expanded into a sophisticated counterintelligence operation spanning the continental United States. Operating from a classified facility outside Washington, D.C., they coordinated with federal agencies, state governments, and private sector partners to identify and neutralize what had become known internally as the infrastructure network. The scope of what they had uncovered defied every previous assessment of foreign infiltration capabilities. From their secure command center, Victoria monitored operations in 17 states where similar patterns had been identified. Coordinated positioning of operatives in critical infrastructure roles, systematic preparation for attacks designed to force federal intervention, and sophisticated financial networks supporting long-term strategic operations. Amanda Cross, now wearing the rank insignia of a major after her rapid promotion, coordinated field teams from multiple agencies. Her desk was covered with reports from operations that read like something from a thriller novel: arrests of water treatment plant managers in Texas, telecommunications engineers in Florida, and transportation coordinators in Colorado, all connected by the same financial networks and communication patterns Victoria had first identified in the Pacific Northwest. "Ma'am, we're receiving confirmation from Team 7 in Atlanta," Amanda reported. "They've identified and neutralized the operatives targeting the Southeast Power Grid interconnection. No resistance, and they recovered intact sabotage equipment." Victoria nodded, making notations on a master timeline that tracked operations across the country. What about the financial intelligence from the Chicago arrests? Director Pierce, now serving as the task force's senior intelligence coordinator, approached with a tablet displaying the latest analysis. We've traced funding back to shell corporations in Romania, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. The total operation appears to have been funded at over $500 million across 15 years. $500 million, Colonel Morrison repeated, reviewing the financial analysis with the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent his career fighting threats that most people never knew existed. The most sophisticated long-term intelligence operation ever conducted against American infrastructure. Victoria studied the financial networks displayed on the main screen, noting patterns that suggested even more extensive coordination than they had previously understood. It's not just the money that's significant, it's the timeline. 15 years of systematic placement and preparation suggest strategic planning at the highest levels of a foreign intelligence service. Major Shaw, who had been assigned to coordinate state-level security responses, entered the command center carrying urgent communications from field teams. "Ma'am, we're getting reports of unusual activity from our monitoring stations. It appears the network is attempting to activate dormant cells in response to our operations." "Show me," Victoria ordered, moving to the central display where real-time intelligence feeds from across the country painted a picture of coordinated desperation. The screen showed communication intercepts, financial transaction alerts, and movement patterns that suggested the network was attempting to implement contingency plans in response to the systematic dismantling of their infrastructure operations. They're trying to accelerate their timeline, Amanda realized, studying the patterns with the analytical skills she had developed under Victoria's guidance. Rather than abandon compromised operations, they're attempting to execute attacks with whatever assets remain in place. Victoria's expression became more intense as she processed the implications. Emergency protocols, immediately. All field teams to maximum alert status. They're going to try to create chaos before we can complete the neutralization operations. For the next 6 hours, the command center operated at crisis tempo as field teams across the country responded to attempts by network operatives to implement hasty attacks on infrastructure targets. Water treatment facilities in Phoenix, power substations in Denver, communication towers in Miami all became targets as the network attempted to salvage some strategic advantage from their collapsing operation. But Victoria's systematic approach to dismantling the conspiracy had anticipated this exact scenario. Counter-surveillance teams were already in position at every critical facility where compromised personnel had been identified. When the operatives moved to implement their desperate attacks, they found federal agents waiting for them. All teams reporting successful interdiction, Pierce announced as the final reports came in from field operations. 0 infrastructure damage, complete capture of remaining network assets. Victoria allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she reviewed the final tally. Over 300 arrests across 17 states, the recovery of millions of dollars in sophisticated sabotage equipment, and the complete disruption of an intelligence network that had taken 15 years to establish. "Ma'am," Amanda said, approaching with a communication from Secretary Brennan. "The Secretary is requesting your presence at the White House for a presidential briefing on the operation's conclusion." Victoria was quiet for several moments, considering the invitation with the wariness of someone who had learned to distrust. Official recognition. "You go, Amanda. This was as much your operation as mine, and you understand the technical details better than I do." Amanda looked surprised. "Ma'am, this entire operation succeeded because of your intelligence and strategic planning. The President should hear directly from you about what we discovered. The President should hear from the officer who will continue this work in the future," Victoria replied, her voice carrying a finality that suggested she had already made her decision about what came next. She moved to her desk and began removing personal items from the secure workspace she had occupied for the past 3 months. The network has been neutralized, but the threat they represented will evolve and return in different forms. This mission needs someone who can adapt to those changes. Morrison approached, his expression showing concern that went beyond professional worry. "Victoria, you're not disappearing again, are you?" Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile Amanda had seen from her since their initial meeting at Mountain Home Air Force Base. "Not disappearing, Frank, but there are other networks out there, other threats that operate in the spaces between official oversight and institutional awareness. Someone needs to watch for those patterns." She handed Amanda a sealed envelope containing what appeared to be comprehensive intelligence files. "Everything I learned during 12 years underground is in there. Operational security protocols, financial investigation techniques, pattern recognition methodology, everything you'll need to continue this work through official channels. What about you?" Amanda asked, accepting the envelope with the understanding that she was receiving far more than operational intelligence. She was inheriting a mission that had defined Victoria's entire adult life. "I'll be doing what I've always done," Victoria replied, packing her weathered briefcase with the same methodical precision Amanda had observed during their first operation. "Watching from the shadows, identifying threats before they become crises, and making sure that people like you have the intelligence they need to protect this country." As Victoria prepared to leave the command center for what might be the final time, Director Pierce approached with one last report. "The Foreign Intelligence Service behind this network, we've identified them through financial analysis and communication intercepts. They're already rebuilding, establishing new cover identities and operational protocols." Victoria nodded, unsurprised by the news. "Then the mission continues just as it always has." She turned to address the assembled team, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her entire career to protecting something larger than herself. "What we accomplished here proves that no network is invisible if you know how to look for the patterns. The threats will evolve, but so will our ability to detect and neutralize them." As Victoria walked toward the exit, Amanda followed, still processing the reality that the legendary pilot, who had emerged from 12 years of exile, was preparing to return to the shadows once again. "Will I see you again?" Amanda asked as they reached the secure elevator that would take Victoria away from the operation she had created and led. Victoria paused, considering the question with the same careful thought she brought to every decision. "When the next crisis emerges, when patterns appear that official channels can't detect, you'll know how to find me." The elevator doors closed, carrying Storm Rider away from official recognition and back toward the shadows where she had spent most of her career. But her legacy remained in the form of a dismantled network, a new generation of officers trained to see threats others missed, and the knowledge that some missions truly never end. They simply pass from one generation of guardians to the next. 2 weeks later, Amanda Cross stood in the Oval Office, wearing her dress uniform with the newly pinned rank of Lieutenant Colonel, facing the President of the United States as he reviewed the classified briefing that detailed the most successful counterintelligence operation in American history. President Harrison looked up from the documents, his expression showing a mixture of gratitude and deep concern about what the operation had revealed. "Lieutenant Colonel Cross, according to Secretary Brennan's report, your task force prevented coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure across 17 states." "Yes, Mr. President," Amanda replied, maintaining the professional composure that Victoria had taught her during their months of working together. The network had positioned operatives to simultaneously attack power grids, water treatment facilities, telecommunications infrastructure, and transportation hubs across multiple regions. "Over 300 arrests," the President continued, studying the operational summary. "$500 million in foreign funding, 15 years of systematic infiltration." He paused, looking directly at Amanda. "Where is Lieutenant Colonel Kane? I understand she was the architect of this entire operation." Amanda had anticipated this question and prepared her response carefully. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Kane believes that official recognition could compromise her ability to continue monitoring for similar threats. She prefers to operate through unofficial channels." Secretary Brennan, who was present for the briefing, added his perspective with the understanding of someone who had worked with Victoria for over a decade. "Mr. President, Storm Rider has always operated most effectively outside normal bureaucratic structures. Her decision to decline formal recognition is consistent with her operational philosophy." The President nodded, though his expression suggested he would have preferred to personally thank the woman whose intelligence had prevented a catastrophic attack on American infrastructure. "Very well. Lieutenant Colonel Cross, I'm authorizing the establishment of a permanent task force under your command, dedicated to identifying and neutralizing similar threats." "Thank you, Mr. President," Amanda replied. "I accept the assignment. You'll have unlimited resources, direct access to all intelligence agencies, and the authority to coordinate with state and local governments as needed," the President continued. "The Infrastructure Protection Task Force will report directly to the Secretary of Defense and brief me monthly on threat assessments." As the briefing concluded and Amanda prepared to leave the Oval Office, the President made one final request. "Lieutenant Colonel, if you do maintain contact with Storm Rider, please convey my personal gratitude for her service to this country." "I will, Mr. President." 6 months later, Amanda had established the Infrastructure Protection Task Force as the premier counterintelligence organization focused on threats to American critical systems. Operating from a purpose-built facility outside Washington, D.C., her team combined the pattern recognition techniques Victoria had developed with cutting-edge technology and interagency coordination. The success of their work was measured not in public recognition, but in the crises that never materialized. Water treatment facilities that continued operating normally because compromised personnel had been identified and removed. Power grids that maintained stability because sabotage equipment had been discovered and neutralized. Communication networks that remained secure because infiltration attempts had been detected and countered. Colonel Morrison, now serving as Amanda's senior advisor, reviewed monthly reports that painted a picture of ongoing vigilance against threats that evolved constantly. "We're seeing new patterns emerging," he reported during a routine briefing. "Different funding sources, modified operational security, but the same basic strategy of long-term infiltration." "Which means our work continues," Amanda replied, studying intelligence feeds that showed suspicious activities in regions they hadn't previously monitored. "Have we identified any connection to the original network?" Director Pierce, who had accepted a permanent position with the task force, manipulated displays showing financial analysis and communication intercepts. Preliminary indicators suggest some of the new operatives were trained by the same organization, but they're using completely different cover identities and operational protocols. Amanda made notations on her secure tablet, planning response operations with the systematic approach Victoria had taught her. Prepare surveillance teams for deployment to the identified locations. Full compartmentalization protocols, no operation. Gets discussed outside this room. As the briefing continued, Amanda received a secure message through channels that existed outside normal military communications. The message was brief and unsigned, but she recognized the communication style. Immediately, new patterns detected in Southeast infrastructure management. Financial irregularities suggest coordinated placement. Recommend immediate investigation of water treatment facilities in Georgia and South Carolina. A friend. Amanda smiled slightly, understanding that Victoria Kane continued her mission from whatever shadows she now occupied. The intelligence was precise and actionable, Exactly the kind of insight that had made Storm Rider legendary in the special operations community. "Colonel Morrison," Amanda said, closing her tablet and standing with the decisive movement of someone who had learned command from the best possible teacher. "Prepare teams for deployment to Georgia and South Carolina. We have credible intelligence suggesting infrastructure compromise." That evening, Amanda sat in her office reviewing intelligence reports and operational plans, when she noticed a small package on her desk that hadn't been there when she left for the day. Inside was the original squadron patch Victoria had shown her during their first meeting, the eagle insignia that represented service before everything became classified and compartmentalized. Attached was a handwritten note in Victoria's precise script. "The mission continues. You're doing excellent work. Some of us watch from the shadows so others can operate in the light. VK." Amanda carefully placed the patch in her desk drawer, understanding that it represented more than just a piece of fabric. It was a reminder that the mission to protect American infrastructure would continue regardless of who received credit or recognition, and that some of the most important work happened in spaces between official acknowledgement and absolute necessity. As she prepared to leave her office and return to her quarters, Amanda paused at the window overlooking the Virginia landscape. Somewhere out there, Victoria Kane continued the work she had begun over 2 decades ago, identifying threats, gathering intelligence, and ensuring that people like Amanda had the information they needed to protect the country, the infrastructure. Protection Task Force would continue its work, adapting to new threats and evolving challenges. But Amanda understood that their success depended not just on official resources and government support, but on the knowledge that someone was always watching from the shadows, identifying patterns that others missed, and maintaining the eternal vigilance that freedom required. Victoria Kane had taught her that some missions never end. They simply transform and continue, through new guardians who understood that protecting the country was more important than receiving credit for the protection. The legend of Storm Rider would live on not in official records or public recognition, but in the quiet competence of officers who knew how to see threats others missed and who understood that the most important victories were often the crises that never happened. Tomorrow would bring new intelligence, new threats, and new opportunities to continue the mission. But tonight, Amanda could rest in the knowledge that the network which had threatened American infrastructure for 15 years had been dismantled, and that the methods for detecting similar threats had been passed to a new generation of guardians. Shadows might conceal threats, but they also concealed protectors. And as long as people like Victoria Kane and Amanda Cross understood that distinction, the mission would continue regardless of the challenges that lay ahead. 2 years after the infrastructure network had been dismantled, Amanda Cross stood before a gathering of the nation's top intelligence and security officials at a classified symposium on domestic threat assessment. Her presentation detailed patterns and methodologies that had become the gold standard for identifying long-term infiltration operations. But few in the audience knew that the techniques originated from a woman who officially didn't exist. The key to detecting coordinated infrastructure infiltration is pattern recognition across multiple data streams, Amanda explained, displaying analysis techniques that Victoria had developed during her years underground. Financial anomalies, personnel movement patterns, and communication signatures create a triangulation that can identify hostile networks years before they become operational threats. General Helen Reeves, now serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, asked the question that Amanda had been expecting. "Lieutenant Colonel Cross, these methodologies are remarkably sophisticated. Where did the Infrastructure Protection Task Force develop such advanced analytical capabilities?" Amanda had prepared her answer carefully, understanding the need to protect Victoria's operational security while acknowledging the debt that her entire organization owed to Storm Rider's intelligence. "General, our techniques evolved from lessons learned during the Pacific Northwest operation. combined with analysis of historical infiltration patterns and consultation with retired special operations personnel. It was technically accurate while revealing nothing about Victoria's continued involvement in their work. Over the past 2 years, Amanda had received dozens of unsigned intelligence reports through secure channels, each providing actionable information about emerging threats that her official sources would have missed. The symposium continued with presentations from other agencies, but Amanda's mind wandered to the secure message she had received that morning through the anonymous channels Victoria used for communication. New financial patterns detected in Midwest infrastructure companies. Recommend investigation of Illinois and Wisconsin power grid management personnel. Timeline suggests activation within 6 months. After the symposium concluded, Amanda returned to her office to find Colonel Morrison waiting with an expression that suggested significant developments. "Ma'am, we've received confirmation from our Chicago field team. The intelligence about Illinois Power Company infiltration was accurate. They've identified and arrested 3 operatives who were positioned to sabotage transmission infrastructure. Any connection to previous networks?" Amanda asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Same training methodology, similar communication protocols, but completely different funding sources and cover identities," Morrison replied. "It appears to be a new network using lessons learned from the previous operation's failure." Amanda nodded, unsurprised by the revelation. Victoria had warned her that the dismantling of one network would inevitably lead to the creation of others, each more sophisticated and harder to detect than the last. The mission never truly ended, it simply evolved to meet new challenges. That evening, Amanda received an unusual request through official channels. A young Air Force lieutenant named Sarah Williams had submitted a transfer request to the Infrastructure Protection Task Force, citing interest in pattern analysis and domestic security operations. Her personnel file showed exceptional analytical skills and flight experience that reminded Amanda of her own background when Victoria had first selected her for the Storm Rider operation. Amanda approved the transfer immediately, understanding that the mission required constant renewal through new personnel who could see threats with fresh perspectives. Victoria had taught her that the greatest operational security came not from restricting information, but from ensuring that critical knowledge was passed to multiple guardians, who could continue the work if any individual was compromised. 3 months later, Lieutenant Williams had proven herself invaluable to the task force, developing new analytical techniques that improved their ability to detect emerging threats. During a routine briefing, she made an observation that caught Amanda's attention. "Ma'am, I've been analyzing the communication patterns from our recent operations, and I'm seeing signatures that suggest our intelligence sources have access to information that should be restricted to the highest levels of foreign intelligence services." Amanda studied Williams carefully, noting the sharp intelligence and intuitive understanding that had originally drawn Victoria to select certain officers for sensitive operations. "What's your assessment, Lieutenant?" "Someone with extraordinary access and analytical capabilities is providing us with intelligence that gives us significant operational advantages," Williams replied. "Either we have a source inside hostile intelligence networks, or someone has been conducting independent surveillance operations at a level that rivals anything official agencies could accomplish." Amanda made a decision that Victoria would have approved of. She chose to trust someone who had demonstrated both competence and discretion. "Lieutenant Williams, there are aspects of our operations that exist outside normal bureaucratic channels. People who serve this country in ways that can't be officially acknowledged." Williams nodded, her expression showing understanding that went beyond her years. "Anonymous guardians who operate in the spaces between official oversight and absolute necessity." "Exactly," Amanda replied, recognizing in Williams the same qualities that had made her suitable for Victoria's trust. "Some missions never end, Lieutenant. They simply pass from one generation of protectors to the next. Over the following months, Amanda began preparing Williams for greater responsibilities within the task force, understanding that her own role as Victoria's successor would eventually require her to identify and train the next generation of Guardians. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Amanda received what would be her final communication from Victoria Kane. The message was longer than usual, written with the careful thought of someone preparing to close a significant chapter of her life. Amanda, your work has exceeded every expectation. The Infrastructure Protection Task Force has become everything I hoped it would be and more. The mission is in capable hands with people who understand that protecting this country requires eternal vigilance and the willingness to operate outside conventional recognition. I'm retiring from active intelligence gathering. After more than 2 decades of watching from the shadows, it's time to let others continue the work. You've proven that the mission can continue through official channels when led by people who understand its true nature. The Squadron Patch 1 gave you represents service before recognition, mission before personal advancement, and the understanding that some of the most important work happens in the spaces where heroes choose to remain anonymous. The storm has passed, but new challenges will always emerge. You and officers like Lieutenant Williams are prepared to meet them. Some missions never end. They simply find new Guardians who understand that protecting freedom is more important than receiving credit for the protection. Fair winds and following seas. Storm Rider. Amanda carefully filed the message in her personal safe, understanding that it represented the end of an era and the completion of a transition that had begun 3 years earlier in the skies above Idaho. Victoria Kane had emerged from 12 years of exile to prevent a national crisis, dismantled a network that threatened American infrastructure, and passed her mission to a new generation of protectors. The legend of Storm Rider would live on not in official records or public recognition, but in the quiet competence of officers who knew how to see threats others missed and who understood that the most important victories were often the crises that never happened. Lieutenant Williams approached Amanda's desk with a routine intelligence report, but her expression suggested she understood the significance of what she had been asked to join. Ma'am, the patterns we're tracking in the southeast appear to be evolving. Should we prepare response teams? Yes, Lieutenant, Amanda replied, standing with the decisive movement of someone who had learned command from the best possible teacher. Prepare the teams, maintain operational security, and remember that our mission is to prevent crises before they develop. As Williams departed to coordinate the response, Amanda looked out her office window at the Virginia landscape where autumn colors painted the mountains in shades of gold and red. Somewhere in those mountains, or perhaps far beyond them, Victoria Kane had found whatever peace was possible for someone who had dedicated her entire adult life to protecting something larger than herself. The Infrastructure Protection Task Force would continue its work, adapting to new threats and evolving challenges. But Amanda understood that their success depended not just on official resources and government support, but on the knowledge that the mission itself was more important than any individual who served it. Tomorrow would bring new intelligence, new threats, and new opportunities to continue the work that Victoria had passed to her. The mission never ended. It simply found new Guardians who understood that protecting the country was a privilege that required sacrifice, dedication, and the willingness to serve without recognition. In the end, that was the true legacy of Storm Rider, not the specific operations she had conducted or the network she had dismantled, but the understanding that some missions transcended individual careers and required Guardians who would continue the work regardless of personal cost. The legend was complete, but the mission continued. And that, Amanda understood, was exactly how Victoria Kane would have wanted it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.